So my name is Hannah Kim. I'm the director of the Cheongito Institutional Library here at the University of Toronto. Thank you all for coming. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So thank you again for joining us. So now, after nearly a year of planning, I think sometime last year with Sean, we have been Zooming and discussing about how we can plan out this event. So we are very excited to present today's event, A Journey Through the Culinary History of China, featuring the first ever Western translation of Madame Wu's Handbook on Home Cooking by Dr. Chen here, one of our keynote speakers today. This historic cookbook offers insights into Song Dynasty gastronomy, including the early use of soy sauce and the influence of Central Asian foods. So we have two distinguished speakers lined up for you today. First, we will hear from Dr. Eugene N, a renowned Chinese history food scholar and author. Then we will have Dr. Sean Chen, the translator and annotator of Madame Wu's Handbook on Home Cooking. And Dr. Chen's family is up right here with two kids and his wife. Following their talks, we will have a panel discussion featuring both speakers and Dr. Linda Ray Fang from our Department of East Asian Studies, who is right at the back, waving her hand, and Dr. Jackson Yu Bin Go from the History Department here at the University of Toronto, who is right in front. And the panel will be chaired by Dr. Jeffrey Pitcher from U of T Scarborough campus, right next to Dr. Guo. So I just also want to mention that our library has a strong collection focused on food studies, East Asian food studies. So in collaboration with Dr. Sean Chen, our library has set up a display on those books, some selected works, for you to take a look. So please take a moment to take a look at the display after the event. All right. So I also have to mention that this event is co-sponsored by the Culinary Research Center at the University of Toronto Scarborough and the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. Let's kick things off by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Eugene N, for his talk. Dr. Anderson is Professor of Anthropology Emeritus at the University of California, Riverside. He received his Ph.D. in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. He has done research on ethnobiology, cultural ecology, political ecology, and medical anthropology in several areas, especially Hong Kong, British Columbia, California, and the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. His notable works include The Food of China, Ecologies of the Heart, The Pursuit of Ecotopia, Caring for Place, Everyone Eats, Food and Environment in Early and Medieval China, and in collaboration with his lovely wife, Barbara Anderson, Warning Signs of Genocide. His talk title today is Madame Wu's Cookbook and Food in Song China. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anderson.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks very much for having me and giving me a chance to be involved in this opportunity. I too acknowledge the Native American people who occupied this land for thousands of years. I'm not a China expert. I'm a human ecologist, and I've spent my career studying food production and consumption, and that kind of got me into studying Chinese food, starting out with fishery development in Hong Kong, actually. And I don't have any slides because I find I really can't talk unless I look at the audience. Sort of, if they're looking at the slides instead of me, I can't talk. I'm not sure how much time I have. I count. Yeah, we got about 20 minutes. So call me if I'm running way over 20 minutes. China has I start with a Chinese proverb, or old Chinese saying, when freezing to death, face the wind and stand straight. When starving to death, never bend. Which strikes me as what Chinese farmers had to do for 10,000 years. China has managed to remain a unified country most of the time, more or less successfully, feeding a vast population over a period of more than 3,000 years. During this time, China grew enormously from a small state on the upper Yellow River drainage to an empire larger than any other country except Russia. China has shrunk somewhat since the 18th century, but remains an enormous and tightly integrated realm. The major problem throughout Chinese history was clearly feeding so many people. Famines occurred almost every year, somewhere or another. Major famines were common about every other year, really. Lillian Lee and, of course, Mallory's famous book chronicled this. Food was generally available, but sometimes not easy to get if you were caught in a flood or a drought. Agricultural expansion led to steady degradation of the environment in many ways and places, as Mark Alvin and Rob Marks have shown us. In a number of ways of coping with the environment developed, and the Chinese became fantastically good at getting an enormous amount of food out of very, very few inputs. Madame Wu's cookbook is now, this thing is dying on me, is now about I don't know, people seem to be hearing, am I okay?
I think you can put it on top of this one, just to have it a little bit closer.
Yeah, Madame Wu's cookbook is now about 1,000 years old. It stands at a critical midpoint in this development. It appeared in the Sung Dynasty. It's the first Chinese cookbook with accurate accounts of how much you have to use, and the first to be written by a woman. It may, in fact, be the first cookbook in the entire world written by a woman, at least as far as we know. There are some very few earlier cookbooks, and they usually have men's names. Sean Chen was already well known for his excellent and authoritative translation of Yuan Mei's Garden of Contentment food book, which was probably the most famous Chinese food book. And Yuan Mei's birthday has now been designated as International Chinese Food Day. Anyway, Sean has now provided an equally fine and scholarly translation of Madame Wu's work. It reflects the cooking of a fairly well-to-do but not rich or powerful family in Jiangsu by tradition, reasonably enough, or possibly of Fujian and Zhejiang, according to another story. The book is a fascinating insight into this world, otherwise largely attested through poetry and fiction. Most of the recipes are preserving and processing food rather than for immediate consumption. I count 51 recipes for preserving, although some preserve the food only for several days. There are 34 recipes for immediate eating, as well as 14 for sweets, which could be kept long or eaten right away. There are 75 entries in the book, but some include several recipes, or related recipes. One may compare this with the long and detailed sections on preserving food in the Qimi Niaoshu by Jia Xixie 500 years earlier. Preserving was also important basically forever. Nizan's cookbook. Nizan was a great artist of the Yuan dynasty, and he wrote a cookbook, which also has a number of recipes for preserving and for making liquor and so forth. Modern Chinese cookbooks rarely get into this art. Yuan Mei has several notes on preserving food, but did not make it a major part of his book. Evidently, preserving food was deeply important in medieval China. It continued to be vital, but it was increasingly left to experts, specialists, rather than being a home activity recorded in family cookbooks. Even so, the latest Chinese cookbook to cross my desk, Clarissa Wei's wonderful book, Made in Taiwan, which just came out, not only has several recipes for preserving food, but one, her recipes for pickled mustard greens, is essentially identical to Madame Wu's. You've got a perfect recipe for preserving mustard greens, why change it, you know? At some point, we should ask, what is Chinese food? Many attempts to define and categorize it have appeared over the years. The problem is that China has many different regional traditions. There are many different Chinese languages, which are miscalled dialects, although they're completely separate languages. And the cuisines associated with them are accordingly almost as different as Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian cuisines. A certain family resemblance in Wittgenstein's sense is given by the general use for flavoring of ginger, Chinese bunching onions, soy sauce, fermented beans of some form, Chinese wine, which is actually ale, jiu, and garlic. But of course, they're not used in every dish or in the same ways, and they vary in preferred amount from region to region. Then, of course, there are 56 recognized minorities in non-Han minorities in China, many of which have large populations and their own special foodways. In spite of this, Madame Wu's cookbook remains important as a landmark in the development of the cuisine. It documents the ordinary cuisine of a family in the heartland at that time. The recipes revealed what was popular and available in the lower Yangtze world in Sung times. Considering only species, there are 96 species of animals and plants, plus a couple of minerals, basically salt, mentioned. Counting different varieties of, or processing forms of the same thing, such as the different types of ginger, gives us 122 different ingredients. By far the commonest in terms of mentions is salt. It's mentioned in at least 45 recipes and clearly implied in a lot of others. A long second is Sichuan pepper, which shows up in 20 recipes, lest you thought it was just in Sichuan. Here it is all down the Yangtze River. Sugars in 16, vinegar in 15, ginger in 13, soy paste in 12. Soy sauce rates a mention. If indeed it was the modern form, it was one of the earliest recipes that mentioned this liquid, which was only invented about that time, or just earlier. Before that, they just had the paste. Pork, or generic meat, which we can assume to be pork then as now, is mentioned in 11 recipes. Other meats include chicken, goose, and mutton. Beef is conspicuously absent, probably because there was a feeling that cattle work hard for us and deserve respect. Buddhist feelings encourage this, since Buddhism came from India where cows are sacred. Game is not mentioned, except for yellow sparrows, which were probably yellow-breasted buntings and similar birds. Fish includes carp, grenadier anchovy, and various unspecified fish, which are probably carp of some sort. Crabs and clams figure in a couple of recipes, but this is not a very water-oriented cookbook, which is kind of odd since it's from the lower Yangtze, but it may have been from an inland area. Vegetables are numerous and diverse. Cucumbers and eggplants sweep the field, but various beans, melons, and other fruits and vegetables occur. Bok choy, choy sum, and mustard greens get special attention. Several fruits are noted. The most interesting set of recipes from a culture context standpoint are the sweets and pasta recipes at the end. These include zungzi, much like modern ones, but they also include a fascinating noodle dish in which the noodles are topped with apricot kernel paste, sesame seed paste, pickled and fresh cucumbers, Lee's pickled eggplant, salt pickled garlic chives, and meat if you want it. The seed paste mark this as a Central Asian contact dish. Similar dishes with mixes of seed paste and pickles occur in the Yinshan Chengyao of the Yuan Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty Court Manual of Nutrition and Cooking, which is kind of an amazing book. But it's interesting because, you know, when Paul Buell and I translated that book, we thought that these weird seed paste and pickles recipes were new and probably invented by the Mongols. But no, they are already in the Sung Dynasty book. Several of the recipes of the sweets are clearly West Asian. The ones using butter and white flour unmistakably. Ones for short pastry and halva could not possibly be other than, you know, the Persian and Near Eastern dishes. The spread of these recipes across Central Asia presumably happened in or just before the Tang Dynasty, when all things Central Asian were popular in China and when Chinese cuisine was not very developed. Around a dozen West Asian recipes, or ingredients, around a dozen West Asian ingredients are mentioned in these recipes. Wheat and sheep, of course, have been known for thousands of years, but dill, fennel, cucumber, carrot, sesame, and others were fairly new. And myrrh, which shows up in one recipe, was downright exotic, a medicinal item, probably very recently introduced from the Near East. Fairly well-established Western foods like cilantro and Western ball onions seem absent. Eggplants and walnuts are equivocal. Forms are native to China, but the usual cultivated forms are Western. Tang was famously a major time of borrowing. Many of these plants came in that era. By contrast, and this surprised me about this book, the foods from Southeast Asia are very few. There's a mention of white pepper, none of black pepper, no cinnamon, cloves, nutmegs, or other characteristic Southeast Asian spices. Yet, Song had extensive trade with the Nanyang. So this brings us to some questions of what had happened. There, in the Qimi Niaoshu, there's a recipe for duck stir-fried with spring onion, salt, and black bean sauce, which may be the first recipe for stir-frying that is actually recorded. That form of cooking was surely known before, since woks are shown in Han tomb kitchens, but we have no recipes. Then the Tang Dynasty strongly contrasts with Sung. It was an age of very simple cooking. Du Fu's extremely extensive and descriptive poetry is probably the best single source we have. His ideal meal was sliced raw river fish, garnished at best with spicy leaves of various local herbs. Wang Wei, a Buddhist poet, also seems to have regarded sliced raw fish as the best meal. He abstained from mammal and bird meat for religious reasons, but still. Madame Wu has no reference to raw fish. Ni Zhang, writing somewhat later, mentions it, but basically raw fish was kind of out of style. Ordinary daily fare in the Tang Dynasty was boiled grain, rice or millet, and coarse vegetables such as mallow and sow thistle. Wang Wei condemned high living. He idealized mallows, goosefoot, water shield, and bean leaves as the proper vegetables. These are also in Du Fu and other literature. But they are not mentioned at all by Madame Wu. Even mallows, the staple vegetable of earlier dynasties, does not get a reference. By contrast, Chinese cabbage, rarely mentioned in earlier times, gets 7 mentions by Madame Wu, not counting 4 references to unspecified greens that were probably for this plant. So Chinese cabbage by this time had evidently been bred to be the superior green vegetable of China, as it is now. The classic trope, and really classic, going right back to the Chinese classics, ale and meat for high living was well attested in the poet's work from Tang and in Chinese literature in general from the Warring States onward. Zhou is usually translated wine, but I'm using here the technical translation ale, fermented grain alcohol drinks, unhopped and not distilled. In Tang, grape wine actually was available, and distilled liquor, shaojiu or baijiu, was beginning to appear. By Sung, grape wine was not found in Madame Wu's part of China, but distilled liquor was probably around. Du Fu got rather little meat, especially during the hard times after the An-Lushan Rebellion, but he certainly got plenty of ale. He mentions it no fewer than 166 times in his poetry. I counted. Helped by the recent wonderful translation, complete translation of Du Fu's poetry into English, which is wonderful to have. Other poets whose complete works are in modern editions were similarly besotted. Wang Wei managed to get 37 mentions into his quite small collection of poetry. Meng Haoran gets 28, also into a much smaller corpus. If Li Bai's poetry ever comes out in a convenient edition, we have some serious counting to do. Li Bai, is known as the drunken immortal, otherwise famous for his consumption. There are few, if any, new foods in Madame Wu's that are not mentioned in earlier sources. The difference is mostly the banishment of the coarse foods. Michael Freeman, back in the classic volume that Casey Chang edited, classically pointed out that China's great cuisine, the complex, highly flavored, unique, and varied cuisine we know and love, developed in Sung. This fits with Jack Goody's well-known argument that elaborate cuisine depends on a middle class. Because if you have only an upper class and a lower class, the upper class will eat big hunks of meat and fish, and the poor will eat whatever they can get, which is very little. The middle class is under considerable pressure to try to invent something fancy so they can show off and be fancy and flowering and use little tiny bits of meat as if they had a lot of meat and so on. You've got to invent if you don't really have the money to put on the dog, but really want to. So Jack Goody was one of my mentors in this game, argued for this, and I think he was quite right. And you get this huge development of a middle class in China in the 1000s when Madame Wu's cookbook comes out. And so here we get the first of that coming out. So the elites, of course, in the Sung Dynasty ate really well. Patricia Ebery, reporting on the Huizong Emperor, notes that there were 1,069 cooks and cooks' helpers working in the palace. Feeding everyone in the palace required several thousand pounds of flour a day, and each year tens of thousands of sheep, to say nothing of 32 tons of sugar, from Pat Adry's book on Emperor Huizong. Necessities increased. There's two famous lists that record them all. Wu Zimu said, the things that people cannot do without every day are firewood, rice, oil, salt, soybean sauce, vinegar, and tea. Those that are just slightly better off cannot do without some shafan, some food to help the rice go down with the soup. Another list related but independent says that oil, salt, soybean paste, salted fermented beans, ginger, wild pepper, and tea were necessary. Wild pepper, I said, to be some kind of Sichuan pepper. Tea may have been essential only to well-to-do people in the tea-growing areas, but the text does not say that. And getting into the fact that tea is considered a necessity and soybean paste are considered a necessity, we're already dealing with a middle-class cuisine. You know, the poor are not going to be buying that stuff, and the rich don't have to worry about necessities. Wheat foods were already important. Baked cakes like xiaoping, boiled ones similar to modern year cakes, dangbing, steamed ones, which are zhengbing, were already a big deal in the Sung Dynasty. Dumplings were very important and as varied as they are today. There were steamed buns, mantou-like solid breads, wontons, and baos of various sorts. Noodles were particularly creative. There are all kinds of noodle soups with pork, lamb, chicken, bamboo shoots, and others. Xiaoping were also known as huping, Iranian cakes, which leaves you in no doubt where they came from. And they could be stuffed. They would be stuffed from pig pancreas and bone marrow and things like that. Distilled alcoholic drinks were known in Sung. They include some known today, including rose dew, which is vodka in which red rose petals have been steeped. That's wonderful stuff. I recommend it. There were all the different kinds of joe that we know and love, flavored with chrysanthemums and so forth, some made of grape instead of grain, unusually. But there was chrysanthemum and prickly ash and foxglove and wolfthorn berries, galgechi, whatever that is in Mandarin. And even vipers, the snake wine, which is still around today, was being made in the Sung Dynasty. Malt sugar and cane sugar were both widely used and sometimes mixed. Previously, there had not been that much cane sugar. You mostly had to deal with malt sugar. But by Sung, cane sugar was getting to be very common, and cane sugar was raised in South China. Luxury had progressed to the point where self-conscious simplicity was an ideal. Andrea Montanari has recently written this wonderful study of simple soups from Su Shi onward in Sung Thought and Ideal. She quotes many poets of the time on the virtues of a simple soup of shepherd's purse, which is a very tasty but minor weedy crop. Minorities in the South, of course, ate what they could get, especially grains and root crops and fish along rivers and coasts. There were already boat-dwelling people, like the people I lived with and studied in Hong Kong years ago, living on their watercraft, subsisting on seafoods, and often eating the fish raw. Sung sources say that pregnancy involved a whole realm of avoidances to prevent marking the child. If the mother ate rabbit meat, the baby would have a hair lip. Western mothers thought that when I was a kid. It's a worldwide belief. If she ate lamb, the baby might be weak. If she ate turtle, the baby would have a short neck. If she ate donkey meat, the pregnancy would go on too long. Donkeys carry their young for 11 months, and so on. After death, people were supposed to fast for 3 days, then to avoid meat and alcoholic drinks for 25 months into the third year, that classic 3-year mourning period, which really was 2 years and a month. All right. I was fascinated to discover in one of these Sung Dynasty sources that there was a Zhuang people, Thai-speaking people's custom of buying water, meaning to get water to wash the corpse of a family member. I ran into this in Hong Kong among the boat people I studied in 1965. I learned the hard way. I had to get water from a standpipe well every day, and people would ask me, "Where are you going?" which is a standard Cantonese greeting, and I said, I'm going to buy water, and I got these really strange looks. And it took about 2 of those looks to make me ask my field assistant, what's going on? He says, oh, you use buying water only when you're going to wash your corpse of a family member. And so this is a Zhuang Thai custom transferred into Cantonese society, which goes a long way to indicate that the Cantonese are Zhuang who learned to speak Tang Chinese, which some people have claimed they are, not without some reason. Crabs were popular enough that there's a couple of different books on crabs from the Sung Dynasty. In monographs on particular foods were known as pulu, and there are a lot of them. This was a genre beloved of Sung literati. And they inspired a subgenre of punned accounts in which the descriptions of seafood, or rather sea commodities, could also be read as descriptions of a human. Probably the ultimate form of this was achieved by the great writer Su Shi, who deserves to be even better remembered than he is. He was quite an amazing guy. In his time, scallops were popular enough to inspire him to create a fictional discourse in which the scallop appears as a human scholar, master scallop. The ambiguity and frequent double or multiple meanings of classical Chinese allow the entire recipe to be read either as a discourse on scallops and how to cook them, or as the life of a particular scholar had a bunch of silly vicissitudes. It's just hilarious. Look it up. Meanwhile, the Khitan, Jurchen, and Tongut of the Liao, Jin, and Xixia dynasties were existing independently of Sung and eventually, encroaching on Sung territory quite successfully. They ate wheat products and meat and reveled in dairy products. They did a great deal of hunting and fishing. The Khitan had a first fish rite, which was famous. It was a huge celebration. They'd ice fish for the first big fish of the spring, often a sturgeon, and then the emperor got it, and all kinds of fun things. Game meats included deer, raccoon dog, bear, marmot, ground squirrel, game birds, wild fruits and nuts, including hazelnuts, chestnuts, pine nuts, cornels, pears, and the like were eaten. Salt was preserving food. There's a Sung dynasty traveler who went to the Liao dynasty's capital and found them eating decorated wooden bowls brimmed with slavish food. He had a low opinion of the Liao. First came camel gruel, consumed to the ladle. There was stewed bear fat, mutton, pork, pheasant, and rabbit, and there were dried benefit, venison, pigeon, duck, bear, and raccoon dog. Raccoon dog is said to be quite a delicacy, all of which were cut into square chunks and strewn on a large platter. 2 Iranian-type youths in pristine clothing, each holding a napkin and a spoon and knife, cut all the various meats for Han envoys to consume. The Sung enjoyed the medieval warm period. This brought heavier rains, increasing the chance of floods, but also brought better rains in the dryish parts of the country. So you tended to have some flooding in the south and east, but it helped the dry areas a lot. The early 12th century began to unravel this glorious age. Cold, wet weather in North China led to huge floods on the Yellow River, and there were less and less good management of water resources. The conflict between Sung and Liao heated up, and then the Jin dynasty got into it later, and water management really went to pieces, and the Yellow River rampaged. Ling Zhang, who many of us know, has done this incredibly wonderful study of the problems at that time. So erosion hit the lowest lands, and the upper Yellow and Yangtze River carried enormous amounts of good topsoil away. This led to massive siltation and chaos in the lower riverbeds. One cause of massive erosion was deforestation, and much of this was connected with iron making, ink making, and other industrial processes. There have been some wonderful studies of deforestation in Sung China ever since Robert Hartwell's classic account from 1962. Recently, Joe McDermott studied, a late, very much lamented historian, studied forest plantations and did this really quite amazing book. I mean, I couldn't believe it. All the things that the German foresters created in the 19th century, and it was so new and fascinating, even stand planting and selecting the right type of tree and a whole bunch of forest management stuff that I won't go into. They were all doing that in the Sung Dynasty. I don't know if the Germans later learned about it, but here it was independently invented, 800 years earlier. Anyway, eventually the Mongols conquered the Jin dynasty in 1234 and Sung in 1279. Marco Polo visited Hangzhou shortly after that and found it an incredibly rich city with countless restaurants and amazing food choices. His narrative was once questioned for exaggeration, but it's thoroughly confirmed by Chinese sources of the time. Even the huge pears, 5-pound pears, you thought, oh, nobody has 5-pound pears, but the Chinese sources confirmed that. Unless there's any doubt that Marco Polo got to China, he has eyewitness accounts of the species of cranes in Mongolia, and you can tell what species he's talking about. And you can be sure he didn't get that from hearsay. He had to be seeing those cranes and describing them from life. Anyway, China has, climate was initially on the Mongol side. Genghis Khan was born at the height of the medieval warm period when Mongolia was warmer and wetter than at almost any other time. So he rode out when the Mongols could expand their horse herds greatly. By 1279, things were beginning to slide, and then the Yuan dynasty had to face the awful times of the Little Ice Age, which leveled the Mongols down pretty severely everywhere. The horribly cold, erratic weather of the 14th century destroyed them, and then they fell. And after that, the Little Ice Age continued, and then Timothy Brook, as you may know, has just got out a historical study of how the renewed, horribly cold episode in the 1600s contributed to the fall of the Ming dynasty, getting away from the sun. So the food legacy of Sung is somewhat equivocal. No major new crops or improvements are noted, except that new rice and beans came in from Vietnam, but they weren't very common yet in Sung. On the other hand, China's food sophistication increased greatly. Restaurants flourished. Gourmet cuisine was widespread. There was a new middle class that was very much into that. Literacy was widespread, judging from the enormous amounts of poetry, philosophy, statecraft, joke books, and general writings that appeared. By the end of Sung, Chinese cuisine was well established and reached serious levels of gourmetship, but China was also stressed by population growth and density, environmental decline and mismanagement, and violence. The Chinese coped, as always, and succeeded in managing the environment and growing food well enough to keep increasing in population, in wealth, and in sophistication up to the present. Today, the future is unclear, but it was very unclear even in 1279. We await the future with concern and interest. So thank you. I think that's about 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson, for your enlightening talk. Just due to time constraint, we'll save all the questions for the Q&A session during the panel session. So now let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Sean Chen. So we are again delighted to welcome him back once again. He delivered a talk in our library back in 2020, just before the pandemic, just a few days before. So I still remember the panel that we had with the Dr. Fung here, and I don't know whether Dr. Graham Sanders is here or not, but he was chairing the session. And now, 3 years after, with a new translation, congratulations, Dr. Chen. So Dr. Chen is a researcher in Chinese culinary history and associate at the University of Michigan Center for Chinese Studies. He is the award-winning translator of the books Recipes from the Garden of Contentment and another book, The Way of Eating, both earning Best in the World awards at the 2018 and 2019 Gourmand World Cookbook Awards. In addition, he served as a consultant and presenter for the award-winning PBS television series Confucius Was a Fruity. I love to watch that, and I think your kids would love that, watching the show. Beyond culinary research, he is a biomedical engineer by profession, working in the fields of medical imaging and computer assisted surgery. I don't know how he's managing two different areas so well. His top title is Madame Wu's Medieval Chinese Home Cooking. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chen.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, really. And it's a joy to be able to speak things to Gene here. I mean, the previous books, including this one, I think would have been completely impossible without the kind of academic suggestions and input from Gene. So, I mean, hey, it's here because he helped out, really, huh? I also want to thank the panelists, Jeffrey, new head of UFT Scarborough Campus Culinary Group, to Linda, to Jackson, and really to thank Hannah, her tireless efforts. This event wouldn't have been possible at all. So we also want to start off to say that I want to acknowledge that this is on native land, and that these lands are the ones that really support all and sustain us all, and so we should keep that in mind as we go forward with this talk. Gene has already gone through a lot of what Song Dynasty has offered in Chinese culture, as well as its more cosmopolitan worldly connections, how we see ideas freely transferred from China to peoples from the Central Asia cultures, as well as all the way to the Near East, to the Eastern Mediterranean areas. So let's take a look at what everything has been put into this book and see how it all integrates it together. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Wushi Zhongkuilu, Madame Wu's cookbook, and how it reflects the influences from all the way to the Mediterranean. But more importantly, I also want to talk about the translation process, a little bit about the home cooking, but specifically about Madame Wu herself. So who is Madame Wu, this person? And what was life like for her? And what are the sort of domestic cuisines that she was putting out from the kitchen in medieval Song China? So the Wushi Zhongkuilu is a thin cookbook. It's really quite thin. It's basically just domestic recipes from her own kitchen, and again, from medieval China. It is the only pre-19th century culinary work by a Chinese woman still existing in its entirety. Out of thousands of years of history, this is the only one that still exists in its entirety. And I find that really, really surprising, really shocking in some ways. In fact, if we wanted to expand that a little bit further, it is one of two that we know pre-19th century culinary works by Chinese women. So thousands of year history, only two. And only 4 such books before the 20th century. So in general, it kind of shows you, wow, there needs to be more study in this area. But regardless, the Wushi Zhongkuilu is also very interesting in that, it not only is it mentioned by multiple publications everywhere else, but it mentions that it's the first place in which soy sauce was mentioned and possibly used and introduced into Chinese cuisine. If we think about Chinese cuisine together today, it's very hard to think about it without soy sauce. And indeed, before the Song Dynasty, soy sauce was quite the rarity. In fact, most of the time it was just soy paste. And so this is one of its entries, or it marks its entries into Chinese cuisine. As well, it is also the first Chinese cookbook with precise recipes. Most of the recipes or cookbooks, in quotes, that we see during that period were actually not cookbooks in the modern sense of the word. They are more food lists. And so, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but this is the broad strokes about the Wushi Zhongkuilu. And, this is kind of what drew me in, just to see, hey, there are several firsts here. Maybe this is worth reading. And so I wanted to read this work, and I tried to look for it. And I found out that there's not a lot of stuff on it. It's actually, this is several years back now. And I guess the state of the internet has changed a little bit, but it was hard to find actual original copies of the work, even transcribed. And so while I was able to find them in two sources, oh, it's coming back, okay. So one was in Wikisource, another in CTExt, and these are fantastic resources. If you do any sort of these sort of work, I highly suggest these sites. But being a, I guess, more comfortable reader in English, I naturally look for an English translation. And as with a lot of these works, these culinary works from way back in Chinese history, no Western language translations existed, which means that I actually have to read the classical Chinese text. And while Wikisource and CTExt are great, the problem is always with philology, or rather the source of it. Well, disappeared again. So a professor actually that I spoke with at a conference a few years back said, you have to practice safe philology. And it's funny. And it's true, if you do not know where the text comes from, you can be potentially studying something or translating something completely wrong. And so I naturally try to look for the original, an original edition. And luckily, I found it at the Harvard Yenching Library. I mean, they are fantastic. This is what great libraries do. They hold fantastic things and they put it out open freely for everyone to access. And inside the Harvard Yenching Library lies a copy of this anthology, 说服, which is collections of, it's an anthology on a collection of various works. And this is the Yuan Dynasty, Ming Dynasty edition of this Yuan Dynasty work, which is so by the time this edition got copied, is already several centuries. So as I went through and I started reading this book, it really drew me in the weirdness of everything. Because we're talking about Chinese cuisine, and the thing is, we all have our perspectives on what, quote, Chinese cuisine is, but at the end, we have this idea of soy sauce, light, pleasant flavors with ginger and green onions, and some vague sort of descriptors in that manner. But when you read Madame Wu's text, you are just shocked by how different things are 800 years ago. I mean, when I say that, it's kind of like, of course, 800 years, but it is very different. It's almost as if you're looking at a different cuisine, a different country altogether. And so I went through the book and I started to do the translation in my head. But beyond just questions on the recipe, beyond questions on what these ingredients are, a bigger one came up. And the question is, who exactly is this Madame Wu? Who is Madame Wu? So I want to preface this by saying that we don't know anything. And if that's the answer you need, you can actually just go home now. But I'm going to keep on going. In fact, to know who Madame Wu, we do not have that much information. We know Madame Wu through 4 characters. 4 characters through this anthology. And it's Pujiang Wushi. So her name is Wu, so Wushi over here. In this context, basically Wushi means that you have a married woman with a maiden name Wu. So it's actually, when you say Madame Wu, it's actually not the family she's married into. It's most likely her original maiden name. And then you have Pujiang. Pujiang is a district in the Zhejiang province. It's just southwest of Shanghai, in fact. Great climate, a little bit humid, 4 distinctive seasons, always raining. There's a lot of hills punctuated by ponds and lakes, and just threaded with rivers. It's a very pretty place. If you look at the pictures there, you really want to go there. But importantly, the way that it informs Madame Wu's work in terms of her cookbook, her cooking, is that Pujiang and Zhejiang are famous for its culinary and brewing traditions. In fact, Pujiang is inside something called Jinhua. And you should know that, if you eat Chinese food a lot, you'll know Jinhua is the place where the hams get made. So, the curing, the pickling, the brewing, everything, you see it in Zhejiang. And maybe this is how Madame Wu was inspired and, eventually inspired to write her cookbook. But that really doesn't tell us much, right? I mean, it tells us a little bit. But what else can we get out of it? In spite of the direct information that we get from the title, what else do we know? So for the first thing is, there's also a second part of the name. This is Wushi Zhongkuilu. And the idea behind Zhongkui, or 中馈录, you can translate that as the records on the essential matters of domestic cuisine. And 中馈 itself is quite an old term dating back to, I guess, the late Bronze Age China. And what they do is they talk about, the importance of women basically not doing anything but staying in the kitchen. So this is all the way back in the I Ching. This is the text in which people used to read fortunes and whatnot. But the fact that she used this title for her work means that she believes that this is actually the role that she serves, and she actually serves it very well in this writing. So it emphasizes the belief that she believes that her duty is in doing fantastic domestic cuisine. The other part is that she has written this work, she wrote it, and that it was preserved up to our time, which means that she either lived in a well-to-do household, or she's educated, or actually both. And the last part, the way that we know that this work most likely is in the Song Dynasty, is the anthology in which everything was included. The anthology was published in Yuan Dynasty, I think around 100 years after Song Dynasty went away. And if you look at it, inside that anthology, her work was basically spliced together and just stuck into a whole bunch of other Song Dynasty works. This is why many other anthologies, some of which the sources are a little bit less fuzzy, actually put the full name of this work as Song Pujiang Wushi Zhongkuilu. So, the Song Dynasty, Pujiang, Madame Wu's important cooking stuff. So anyways, it's a really long name, so I'm not going to use that. Can we gain more from this work? Because right now we're just reading the title as well as thinking about where this book was put into an anthology. Luckily, by reading through the recipes, we get more ideas about what Madame Wu's life was like and what was like in a home kitchen during the Song Dynasty, during this medieval Chinese period. What is this cookbook? It is actually a cookbook. Okay, maybe cookbook is a misnomer because it's more of a pickling and fermenting book. I mean, Gene has gone through the talk in his talk about how many of the items, the recipes inside, were actually fermentation and pickling things. So maybe cookbook is not it. This is his fermentation book. But there are 3 chapters. The first one's on meat and fish. Again, a lot of pickling, a lot of preserving. Preparing vegetables. In fact, that's the direct translation. In fact, it's more pickling a whole bunch of vegetables. And then finally, sweet foods. So Miranda Brown, who is also an academic reviewer for this, has noted that the sweet food section is surprisingly large for this work, which kind of says something about either Madame Wu really liking sweet foods, or that sweet foods were actually an important part of the Song Dynasty meal. And the second part is, it is nice. It's 73 recipes, and it's a really thin book, which makes it relatively easy thing to translate. Miranda said that it was disarmingly slim. I like how she put that. By reading through the recipes, though, we start to notice a few things about the home cooking at the time. And from that, we can start to see what the medieval Chinese kitchen looks like. So what does a kitchen look like? Most of the time when we think of a kitchen, we think of 2 things. We think of somebody chopping stuff up, and we also think about a stove where you cook everything. And yes, these are important during Madame Wu's medieval kitchen, and yes, it is still very critical. But what is even more critical is what is on the side. It's the pantry. In fact, calling it a pantry may even be wrong. It's almost like a warehouse if you look at the recipes. So why do we say that? Most of the recipes themselves are for ingredients. What I mean by that is just that what Madame Wu has noted down for you to cook are themselves not immediately edible. You have to cook what she told you to cook afterwards. So there's a lot of pickled fish, pickled meat. stuff in which you probably don't want to consume directly raw. And so all of these are part of, I think, the home cooking at the time. You have to make your own sauces. You have to make your own pickles. And so, maybe things happen over and over again because now, this kind of trend is coming back in which chefs like to cook things in which they pickled from raw ingredients. So, but Madame Wu this is actually one of the key things if we read into this, that a homemaker, a domestic cook would have to do. They make their sauces, pickles, and dried goods. The second thing that we also notice is that Madame Wu knows her stuff. And the reason we know this is just that as the person who actually does the thing, I'm an engineer by trade, so we do the programming. We have to deal with the messes that are happening in programming and whatnot, while the managers and the marketing people do something else. So if you read a lot of dynastic culinary or cooking books, you do see this kind of dichotomy in which there are people which give you very precise things, and then there's the side in which just kind of sells it. There's the marketing aspect. And in Madame Wu's book, she talks about vessels of all kinds. And so, normally people say, oh yes, you have a chopping board and you cook in a wok. But in Madame Wu, she talks about vessels of all sizes for you to do your pickling, to do your preparation work, from flasks to wide mouth jars to vats to tanks. I mean, this is not just a little jar that you put on your shelf in order to say, I do fermenting. I mean, this is huge work. And so we kind of start to have a picture of what the kitchen in Madame Wu's time looked like. It really is a kitchen with a stove and a chopping board, and then you have an army of jars and vats and flasks ready to serve you pickled and dried goods at any moment. There also are very interesting things about Madame Wu. So we start to read, maybe I'm reading this too much because there's really very little to go on, but inside Madame Wu's cookbook, you also kind of see her character in some ways. So for some of the recipes, she says that you can't rush this. This is sort of for people who are in a rush. And she says that several times. Also, she lists out dishes in which this is nice to eat together. So, you see that kind of like, there's a personal quality to this. And I would like to think that all of this is integrated into Madame Wu's kitchen and pantry. If we examine the recipes more, we get to see what Madame Wu served. And as I said before, these are very, very different things than what we would think about as modern Chinese cuisine. And she doesn't hold back. And the first recipe, I mean, when I say complex and spicy, this is what her marinated crab has. It has black cardamom, has fennel, has shadan, another type of cardamom, has Sichuan pepper, ginger, pepper, other spices, and then all of the top green onion, all pounded together and mixed into this raw crab mixture. Stuff like this still exists in Zhejiang, but if you look at it, it's relatively simple. It's just ginger, vinegar, and maybe some alcohol, some jiu inside. And so you see, even for a dish in which you would have the same name, you have vastly different sort of like flavor profiles going back 800 years. The second is, again mentioned, there's a lot of dried and fermented ingredients, and she places them center stage. Most of the stuff are preservation. Those that do not directly talk about pickling or preservation uses pickling and preservation ingredients that are mentioned in other recipes. And so, we see that on the table, basically everything that is cooked has something that contains directly fermented and pickled ingredients. And lastly, that sweet foods and desserts are extremely important, and a lot of them are Central Asian, Persian, or perhaps even South Asian roots. So we see halvas. We see things that look like, Turkish delights, and even a salty noodle snack that you would see wouldn't be surprised to see in the street corner. I want to go back a little bit. So now that we spoke about the ingredients, we talked about the recipes, I want to examine Madame Wu's words a little bit, because I think it also reveals who she is. And if we compare it to her contemporaries, it also tells you about what her concerns are with and what is the purpose, if we read into that, of this cookbook. And we see that Madame Wu wanted to teach, and that her words are very frank, terse, and very practical. So what I'm showing here, this is 知识有法. This is a section on cooking tips. And even nowadays, this kind of work is really popular in Asia. You see books of this published year after year in Japan and Taiwan about special tips to cook stuff. The first one is, how do you clean pork stomachs? Pork stomachs are hard to clean because they're slimy and whatnot. But here it says, clean pork stomachs with flour and clean pork intestines with granulated sugar. A bit extravagant. Done this way, they will not smell. So that's the first one. And then she goes on to say how to cook bamboo shoots. If you add mint and a small quantity of wood ash, they will not taste unpleasant. So we know that bamboo shoots, for example, in some older specimens in some species, are absolutely horrible in taste if you do not process them first. So, mint is a little bit weird, but maybe an enterprising chef would like to take that up. And there's also something about cooking goose with cherry leaves, and then everything will be tender. Yeah, it's right over there. So she wanted to be able to teach, and she wanted people who look at her book to cook well. If we contrast that to Madame Wu's male contemporaries, it is something else altogether. So this is actually in the same anthology. I just lifted it out of the way I started reading it. And the first line on this page, it really just bugs me. So he says something, this is something like, it says, oh, whoa. So there was a ooh, hoo. And then it says, in order to receive the boons from under the heavens, we must first suffer the melancholy that are under the heavens. And before this and after this, he complains about a whole bunch of people and critiques food. And at the end, you realize that this, even though this is in the cookbook session of the anthology, he is actually not talking about the food. He is talking about himself. And so in some ways, if you contrast it with Madame Wu's work, which is actually about the recipes, about teaching people, you see in this work, it was more about him and showing himself off with a lot of fancy ingredients and dishes. Let's go back to another example of Madame Wu's words. So this is a recipe for garlic, I think cucumbers, probably, or gourd. It's technically gourd, but most likely this is a cucumber because actually it says 小黄瓜, which is cucumber. So if you look at it, it's actually really precise. Take 1 jin of autumn harvested cucumber, blanch it in a solution of slaked lime and alum. So you have to chemically treat the surface first, and then you dry them. Then you marinate them overnight in half a liang. It's like a pound of salt. Take another half liang of salt, 3 liang of peeled garlic cloves, pound them into a fine paste, mix it evenly with the cucumbers, submerge them, pouring back the marinade liquid along with some good simmered jiu and vinegar, and then store them in a cool location. Oh, by the way, you can also do this with winter melon and eggplant. Let's contrast this with something else. So this is the technical name, what the literal translation for this work is also in the anthology, is Cookbook. All right, let's take a look at what this guy is cooking here. The first one, actually down here, it says 光明虾. Okay, didn't like it. It's okay, I can keep on going.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So what you were about to see is, it basically says bright gleaming roasted prawns. All right. So that does tempt you. It sounds great. I would like to eat brightly gleaming roasted prawns. How do you make it? The guy says it in 5 characters. Use fresh prawns. This is in Chinese. Use fresh prawns. That's not exactly a cookbook, right? But yet it's called 食谱, cookbook. There are some other stuff inside here. And there's also a dried meat with, what was it? It's somewhere, 同心生节谱. So basically, it's a hard name to translate, but it's basically dried meat with something with its core tied together, and it's raw. And so, yes, okay, it's dried meat, you tie it together, and it's raw. How do you make it? So if you look at down here, it says here, first tie it together and dry it in the wind. So this is the kind of quality of recipe manuals written by male authors. Compare that to what Madame Wu has, in which everything is very precise, and that she wants you to be able to create it successfully. I think we can read a lot into that too. And I hope that partially with this translation, people would be able to look at this and analyze it more than to the extent that I am able to. I also want to mention, we're going to finish up soon, a few things that I found interesting about the manual, specific recipes inside it. We talk about soy sauce being one of the first times mentioned in this cookbook by Madame Wu. And it seems really amazing. You have a soy sauce, right? But the problem is, how did soy sauce came to be? The thing is, if you look at the recipes, it doesn't seem that inevitable. It seems like soy sauce is just a natural progression of ingredients and sauces and things that already exist, right? So if you look at it, on the left there, you have a meat sauce and a fish sauce. And basically, from people who study, soy sauce, and there's actually a foundation by Kikoman who does this, meat sauces and fish sauces were believed to be the early predecessors of soy sauce. In fact, other versions of meat sauces and fish sauce have beans mixed into it, and eventually they got rid of the meat and the fish altogether, and it turned into soy sauce. In Madame Wu's cookbook, she has both. And actually, if you notice too, they're very heavily spiced. I mean, this is not something that you would expect in modern Chinese cuisine. But you have fish sauces, you have meat sauces, and then you have something called douchi. Douchi basically is fermented soybeans that are dry. I think in English, they call them black beans, black preserved beans, and you have them in various dishes in dim sum. But douchi was an ingredient itself in making other stuff. And in this case, these were soaked in alcohol and water. And these two recipes basically reflect how soy sauce is made in many parts of Fujian and Taiwan. You basically use the fermented bean directly, add salt, and that turns into soy sauce. So this is basically a bean paste that you can eventually squeeze and turn into soy sauce. And I find this extremely interesting. In fact, if you listen to the way soy sauce is called in Cantonese, and Eugene will probably be able to say, I can't say it in Cantonese, it's something like xi yao, right? It's douchi oil, or like the stuff that is squeezed out of it. So, basically this kind of hints at this is actually the beginnings of soy sauce, not because, Madame Wu's book mentioned it, but because all the ingredients are already there. And the idea, Gene and I, we were just talking this idea of inventions don't come out of a vacuum. Basically, when somebody thinks about it, everybody else has already thought about it. It's a zeitgeist almost. And so the creation of soy sauce is inevitable. In organic chemistry, when I see that, I mean, it still kind of scares me because of past experiences. But also, inside Madame Wu's book are these really weird things in which she talks about using things that you would not expect in dishes. So this is 酒粒, so it's like lees from fermentation. And these, basically you have eggplants, but you take 50 coins, 50 wons worth of coins, and you put it on top of your fermenting eggplant. So basically you're contaminating your eggplant with copper and tin and lead, because all that salt and all that 酒粒 will eat away at the coins. Why do you want to do this? Well, the reason why you want to do this is because even after prolonged storage, their colors will remain emerald green as they were brand new. So there's all these kind of stuff. And, considering there's lead inside here, and that, 酒梨 will eventually oxidize into vinegar, what you probably end up with is something called lead acetate. And the Romans love this kind of stuff because they cooked vinegar inside lead containers, which gives it a slightly sweet taste that is very hard to describe. So 酒梨 eggplant, inorganic chemistry, fantastic stuff. And lastly, I want to talk about Turkish delight, right? We don't think of some place in East China having ingredients, having dishes and recipes that you would think of finding in the Mediterranean, inside the Eastern Mediterranean area. But we're talking about something called saboni. And whenever you see words like this in Chinese that you don't understand, that doesn't map to anything, most likely it's a foreign term. It's external to the culture. And so what we see here is instructions that basically say, how do you make this thing? There's something called megu. I have no idea what that is. But then they start talking about things like, don't use walnuts. Some people hate walnuts, I guess. And then you laid it out onto a flat surface, you spread it, you surround it, you hold it in with glutinous rice flour, and then all this kind of stuff. It may not seem like there's anything related to Turkish delight here until you actually start to look up what saboni is. And in fact, this term still exists in the text, in old text. So I think Ibn Battuta, I think that's his name. He's a Moroccan traveler and basically a writer. And he talks about Sabonian's work. There are also other Turkish texts that talk about how to make saboni. And all of them basically have starch, sugar mixed together. And some of them actually pour them onto starched flat surfaces. And then you cut them up and you serve them as Turkish delight. And so when you start to read this, you're like, hey, you know what? Maybe the saboni is the same ones that are being talked about or that people talked about inside those Turkish as well as Moroccan texts. And sure enough, if you look hard enough online, thank you Google for this, is that you do find people in Turkey still making stuff called saboni without walnuts, done almost exactly the same way, spread out on flour. And saboni itself, the etymology, by etymologists, comes from sabon, with the soap. So in French, it's called savon. So and people speculate that saboni is actually how you make soap, right? In the way that they do it in the Mediterranean, you pour your soap mixture onto the floor, you let it harden, and you scrape it up, and you sell it as blocks that they call it savon d'Alep. Anyways, so they call this one saboni most likely because it is almost similar to the way that you make soap. So you have a name that is Mediterranean origin in East China in the medieval era. And so you see how tightly everything is connected together. So I wanted to conclude this talk by just saying that, there's a lot, I think, that more that we can learn from this text. And by translating it, I hope people in, in English language academia can delve more into this. And last thing I want to say that it's been an absolute pleasure translating this book, and I hope that in reading it you can gain the same kind of pleasure and insights that I did. Thank you.